now, let's talk to a man who may not agree with what I just said, but let's have a good old open discussion about the lot of everything. Mike Buckley, former Labour Party advisor. Mike, it's fantastic to have you on the programme. Let's start off talking about Rachel Reeves. People are accusing her of being missing in action. We know that the economy right now is, well, not looking too good, is it? And yet she is off to Beijing with a cohort of banks to go in glad hand. Is that the right approach geopolitically, economically?
Yes, of course it is. I mean, Rachel Reeves is simply doing her job, but it's entirely right that she spends time with foreign governments talking about the UK economy, bringing investments into the country and finding ways that we can collaborate with China in ways that are appropriate for the benefit of our economy and their economy as well. It would be terrible if every time there was something in the news, every time there was a change in statistics or the value of the pound or borrowing costs, the government went into panic mode and decided they had to drop everything and stay here and do what? I mean, what would you expect that she's going to do that can't be done by Darren Jones or Phillips or, people you can see on the screen now, other people who are working in the Treasury, the Prime Minister himself. What we don't want is a government that looks like it presses the panic button after every news story. That wouldn't do the economy good, and it would not be sending a good message to the markets. The government is sending the right message to the markets right now, which is that we're in control, we've got a plan for the economy, we're doing what's necessary to get the economy back on track. After 14 years of
commentators are sort of saying that actually the impacts of the last budget haven't yet really been felt. Yes, they talk about global pressures creating some of the instability we're seeing right now. You might not want to mention Tulip Siddiq right now. She's not really shining a good light on herself issue of some of her funny connections being investigated. But at the end of the day, China is a nation that actively spies on us, is doing so at record levels, that at the very least is behaving mischievously, cutting power cables in oceans, trying to disrupt things. This is really a country that we can trust, and we need to go over there and say, oh, please work with us, when actually they have shown time and again that they're bad faith actors. Surely this is dangerous.
I don't think it is a country that we can trust, quite honestly, and I think that's evident based on the fact that you've just referred to, and also based on the fact that they are actively supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. So clearly China is not a country that we can trust, but it is also not a country that we can ignore on things like the climate crisis that you were talking about before the break, but also when it comes to trade as well. We are still a country that trades with China in many ways, and we will continue to trade with China, I'm sure. That, of course, needs to be done sensibly, and it needs to be done within certain boundaries, and there are obviously things that we would not want to be trading with China and things that we would rightly be cautious of. But they're a huge economy. We can't ignore them. And I think it's right that Rachel Reeves is there to discuss what can be done that would help the UK economy and help us, for example, in terms of security, human rights, etc. as well, while, of course, being aware of the wider context.
They're not going to listen, though. You just said we can't ignore them. It seems to me they've got the whip hand. The idea that Rachel Reeves is going to come back with some sort of astonishing deal that puts China in a corner and somehow helps grow the UK economy, I think, is for the birds. Let's talk about what Kemi Badenoch has said, which is Britain is now essentially operating at the behest of unions. I mean, there have been a very generous public sector payoffs. I'm sure that you would say this was needed. There have been a long time stagnation in wages, the public sector, in a cost of living crisis, and we couldn't have everything grind to a halt with strikes. But it seems to me that, we've given the unions an inch and they want to take a mile.
Well, I mean, thanks for justifying the public sector pay rises so eloquently. I appreciate that. Saves me the job. I don't think that unions are in control of the Labour Party at all. And understandably, of course, the Labour Party has close links with the trade unions and will listen to what they're saying. And there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from the trade unions with the comments that they make, particularly about public services, because they represent so many people there, but also about the private sector as well. So taking their advice, their recommendations, I think is important if we want the economy to run well, if we want public services to run well. The comments, and I read the comments that Kemi Badenoch had made about the changes that are coming into the school system, they seem completely wrong-headed as far as I'm concerned. The government's put its views forward. Some of the education unions have agreed with them, but there's no sense in which the unions wrote these recommendations and they're being implemented by the Labour Party. Labour's doing what it wants to do, and the union has said, we think this is a good way forward. We know there are real problems in our education system. Some of them have been long-standing, some of them created by the last governments, and it's right that Labour is now taking action to improve education for all young people and children in this country.
Well, I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. I think lots of people at mid-level private schools might not agree. Let's talk about Elon Musk now, because I was sitting in a volcanic lair in Lanzarote for the past week, planning to mind my own business, but it all kicked off on X, didn't it? Blimey, it was fun and intriguing to watch, I might point out. But how much of a problem is this for Sir Keir Starmer? Because there are sort of reports now that he'd like to get rid of Sir Keir Starmer before the next general election. He believes that Western civilization is threatened. There's been a lot of pushback. I think the Labour government's policy seems to either be to answer journalists' questions by attacking him or else trying to ignore him. But you sort of said that China can't be ignored. Elon Musk is essentially the richest man in the world, and one would argue perhaps one of the most powerful men in the world.
I don't know how powerful he is as compared to how powerful he believes he is, if you see what I mean. And he doesn't have any power in and of himself. I mean, he runs some very big organisations, obviously X being one, which obviously does have some influence in some quarters. He's probably most influential in the world because of his close relationship with Donald Trump, for as long as that lasts, and who knows, we'll see how long that lasts. But I think for him to say that Keir Starmer's leadership is a threat to Western civilization will sound ludicrous to probably everybody listening to your show.
I don't think it would sound ludicrous to people listening. My concern is he's not alone in saying this. You know, you've got people like Milei in Argentina saying this. You've got, I mean, a lot of people in the rest of the world are looking at Britain thinking we're a mess.
Why do you, I mean, whatever your view of whether you think Keir Starmer's doing a good job as Prime Minister or not, to suggest that he's a threat to Western civilization, to me, just seems like overreach, if I'm honest. I mean, you might think he'd be doing a better job as Prime Minister. You might think he's doing a brilliant job. However bad a job you think he's doing as Prime Minister, or good, in what way is he a threat to Western civilization, which, let's face it spans the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, you know, large parts of the world, all of whom will be entirely unaffected by how good or bad a job Keir Starmer does.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it? Britain was a plucky little international player at one stage, and now a lot of people seem to think we're a basket case. I mean, where in the international community is there a cheerleader for Sir Keir Starmer? He's hardly going out and selling UK PLC on the world stage, is he? Especially at a time where we need economic growth.
Well, I will disagree with you there. I mean, I've been in two international environments recently. So I was at the COP climate conference in November and then spent a week in Brussels in December for various different work reasons. And in both contexts, there was a lot of interest in the Labour Party, a lot of interest in Keir Starmer personally, a lot of optimism at the fact that we'd had a change of government and now had a stable government for the first time in a long time. And at the COP conference, people were very grateful that Keir Starmer turned up and made a significant commitment on climate and emissions. And in Brussels, people were very appreciative of the fact that Keir spent a lot of time in Europe talking to European leaders and in Brussels itself, and making the case that we need a reset of the relationship. So in both contexts, I spoke to a lot of people who had a very optimistic view of the UK and what's happening here under Keir's leadership.
I tell you who is really grateful about those net zero targets and you know, approach to emissions, and that's China. They're very grateful that Sir Keir Starmer's gone down that road, I am certain. Let's talk about Andy Burnham, because he has broken ranks, essentially, and said there should be a national inquiry into grooming gangs. Now, I don't understand why the Labour Party is so lily-livered about this. This, without doubt, is one of the most revolting, horrifying scandals that we've ever seen in UK history, quite frankly. Surely we really do need to grab the nettle and find out what's gone on here.
I mean, I agree with you entirely. It's been a horrific scandal going on for far too long, and it is genuinely awful that the reviews that we've had and the recommendations that were made under Baroness J, probably most importantly, which was a 7-year inquiry costing £200 million. I mean, this was not a half job; it was a full job. It's horrific that the last government refused to implement many of the recommendations in that report, and I hope and expect that this current government will implement those recommendations as soon as possible. Whether there is a case for another inquiry, I'm afraid I don't feel qualified to make that judgment. I haven't read Baroness J's report. I don't know whether it investigated everything. Based on what Andy Burnham said, and he was, I think, referring specifically to the work that he authorised or on what had gone on in Oldham. I think what he was saying is that in that context, he thinks there's more work that needs to be done and more people that need to be spoken to. And if that's the case, that may be applicable nationally, but I'm afraid I just don't have the detail to know that. If that is the case, I hope that it happens. But in the meantime, what I really want to see is all the recommendations from Baroness J's report fully implemented as soon as possible.
A very diplomatic answer. Well done you. Thank you ever so much.